The fluorescent lights of Riverside County Superior Court seemed to flicker with an ominous rhythm as Emma Martinez sat rigidly in the gallery, her 12-year-old frame barely visible behind the mahogany barrier that separated spectators from the proceedings. Beside her sat Captain, her golden retriever, his fur freshly groomed, and his official service dog Vest perfectly aligned, though even his trained composure couldn't entirely mask the anxiety radiating through his muscular frame. Emma's small hand gripped his collar, not for control, but for comfort. She needed to feel his solid presence as much as he seemed to need the grounding of her touch. The courtroom was a study in controlled chaos that had progressively spiraled toward uncontrolled pandemonium. The Martinez custody case had been scheduled for 9 in the morning, a routine hearing that was supposed to establish visitation arrangements and child support modifications following Emma's parents' bitter divorce finalization 6 months prior. Emma's therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Judge Patricia Chen presiding over the case, sat 2 rows behind her, observing with the professional concern of someone who had been treating Emma through this family devastation. The elderly court clerk, Mrs. Henderson, who had witnessed thousands of legal battles in her 30 years of service, kept shaking her head sadly. Even she sensed this was escalating beyond the normal parameters of divorce proceedings. Emma's father, Robert Martinez, stood at the defendant's table wearing an expensive suit that barely concealed his trembling rage. His attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Gerald Thompson with slick-back hair and predatory eyes, was mid-sentence, his voice rising with each allegation he hurled like verbal weapons. "Your Honor, my client's ex-wife has consistently attempted to alienate him from his daughter through psychological manipulation and deliberate interference with their relationship," Thompson declared, his words dripping with contempt. "She has poisoned the child's mind against her own father, creating a false narrative of abuse that never occurred." Emma's mother, Isabella Martinez, jumped to her feet, unable to contain herself any longer. "That's a lie," she screamed, her dark eyes blazing with fury. "He was emotionally abusive to both of us. Emma witnessed the manipulation, the gaslighting, the threats." Her voice cracked with desperation and pain. "And now he wants to use this custody battle to continue controlling us, just like he always has." Judge Patricia Chen, a woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of exhausted expression that came from 30 years of seeing humanity at its absolute worst, banged her gavel repeatedly. The sound echoed through the courtroom like gunshots. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom," she commanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. But her words were drowned out by the escalating voices, the shuffling of papers, the movement of spectators in the gallery who were sensing the impending meltdown. Emma felt her entire body begin to shake. She'd known this day would be difficult. Her therapist had prepared her for it, explaining that custody hearings could become heated, that emotions ran high when parents couldn't agree on their children's futures. But understanding something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were 2 entirely different things. Her chest began tightening. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. Spots appeared at the edges of her vision. The anxiety she'd been managing so carefully for the past 18 months, since the car accident that had taken her best friend's life, came roaring back like a tidal wave threatening to drown her. She could feel her heart racing at what felt like 150 beats per minute. The sounds in the courtroom seemed to amplify to unbearable levels. Her father's attorney was shouting about parental alienation and psychological manipulation. Her mother was crying now, her voice becoming more desperate and less coherent. The judge kept demanding order that nobody was willing to provide. The other spectators, some reporters, some family friends, some court observers, were all staring, whispering, shaking their heads. And then Captain noticed. The dog, trained extensively to recognize the physical and emotional signs of his human's distress, began to shift his weight nervously. His ears perked up. His breathing quickened to match Emma's ragged gasps. His dark eyes darted around the courtroom, seeking the source of danger that his protective instincts told him was threatening his girl. When he couldn't identify an external threat, his anxiety began to manifest in behavior. He stood up, his nails clicking against the polished courtroom floor. He began packing back and forth, a nervous, jerky movement that was completely unlike his normally calm demeanor. "Control that animal," someone in the gallery shouted. Emma heard it as if from a great distance, through water, through fog. Captain's whimpering began softly, a quiet, desperate sound that somehow cut through the courtroom noise more effectively than any shout could have. The whimper escalated, becoming more frantic, more obviously distressed. The dog was feeding off Emma's anxiety, and Emma was feeding off his, creating a vicious cycle of mutual panic that was rapidly spiraling out of control. Captain's tail stopped wagging. His body language screamed distress. Emma tried to reach for him, tried to comfort him the way her service dog trainer, Dr. Michael Hernandez, had taught her, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely coordinate her movements. Tears began streaming down her face. She felt like she couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. Everything felt unreal and hyperreal simultaneously. Judge Chen was now standing, continuing to bang her gavel with increasing force and decreasing effectiveness. "I will clear this courtroom," she threatened, but her authority seemed powerless against the emotional tsunami that had engulfed the proceedings. Emma's mother was openly weeping, her shoulders heaving with sobs. Her father had turned red in the face, his finger pointing accusingly at his ex-wife as he continued shouting. Gerald Thompson was still speaking, his words now completely inaudible beneath the layers of emotional chaos. Dr. Sarah Chen, Emma's therapist, had stood up from her seat in the gallery, her professional concern overriding courtroom decorum. She was moving toward Emma, recognizing the clear signs of a panic attack in the making. Mrs. Henderson, the court clerk, was reaching for a box of tissues, her experienced eyes having seen this kind of breakdown before but never quite at this intensity. Emma felt as though she were drowning. Her 12-year-old mind was being battered from all sides, the guilt that she was the cause of her parents fighting, the fear that she would be forced to choose between them, the helplessness of being a child trapped in an adult situation she couldn't control or escape. Captain's whimpering grew louder, more desperate. The dog was practically vibrating with anxiety, his training and composure completely overwhelmed by his desperate need to protect and comfort his girl. This was the breaking point. This was the moment when two souls, one human, one canine, were simultaneously drowning in panic, anxiety, and despair. The courtroom had become a pressure cooker of human dysfunction, and the only innocents in the room were gasping for air, struggling to survive the emotional violence being perpetrated all around them. Judge Chen's gavel continued banging. The voices continued screaming. The chaos continued escalating. And Emma Martinez, 12 years old and desperately needing just one moment of peace, found herself facing an impossible situation with no way out, or so she thought. She didn't yet know that she possessed the key to everything. She didn't yet understand that the training she'd received, the bond she'd built with her service dog, and the inner strength she'd been quietly developing would soon combine in a moment that would silence an entire courtroom and change everyone's understanding of what a child could accomplish when pushed to the absolute edge of her breaking point. But that moment was coming, and when it arrived, nothing would ever be quite the same again. 6 months earlier, on a crisp morning in early spring, Emma Martinez stood at the entrance of the Pacific Coast Service Dogs Foundation, a sprawling facility nestled in the rolling hills outside of San Diego. The building was modern and welcoming, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked acres of carefully maintained training grounds where dogs of various breeds practiced their life-changing skills. Emma's mother had her hand on Emma's shoulder, not to push her forward, but because she could feel her daughter trembling with a mixture of fear and tentative hope. Emma had been referred to this program by Dr. Sarah Chen, her therapist, after the anniversary date of the car accident that had claimed her best friend's life. For 18 months, Emma had been struggling with debilitating anxiety, recurring nightmares, and panic attacks that seemed to strike without warning. Traditional therapy had helped, but Emma's therapist believed that something more could be beneficial. A service dog, Dr. Chen had explained during their session, could provide Emma with a constant source of grounding and support. It wouldn't be a cure, but it could be a tool that helps her regulate her emotions and feel safer in the world. Captain, a 3-year-old golden retriever with a lustrous coat the color of honey, had already completed his initial service dog training at the foundation. He'd been trained to recognize signs of anxiety and to provide what was called deep pressure therapy, using his body weight to apply gentle, calming pressure against a person in distress. He was certified and ready for placement. But when Dr. Michael Hernandez, the foundation's director and lead trainer, had met with Emma and her mother for the initial consultation, he'd seen something in Emma's case that made him think differently. Dr. Hernandez was a man in his early 60s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who had dedicated his entire life to understanding both dogs and trauma. He had worked with military veterans, first responders, and children like Emma who had experienced profound psychological trauma. In Emma's case, he recognized not just anxiety disorder, but also what he termed acute environmental sensitivity, a heightened awareness of emotional chaos in her surroundings that triggered her own panic responses. "I want to propose something different for Emma," Dr. Hernandez had said during that first meeting, settling into his office chair and gesturing for them to sit. "Captain is already well trained as a standard service dog, but I'd like to enroll Emma in an advanced program that I've been developing, something I call the Therapeutic Response Protocol. It would take additional months, but it could provide Emma with tools that go beyond what traditional service dog training offers." Emma's mother had leaned forward with interest. "What kind of tools?" Dr. Hernandez had chosen his words carefully. Dogs are incredibly sensitive to human emotional states. They can read micro-expressions, changes in heart rate, shifts in breathing patterns, and neurochemical releases that we humans aren't even consciously aware of. Most service dogs are trained to respond to these signals by providing comfort. But I've been researching whether we can train dogs to do something even more profound, to help create psychological states in their handlers through specific, deeply conditioned commands. Not commands that are tricks or performances, but genuine therapeutic interventions. Emma had been listening intently, her anxiety temporarily overridden by curiosity. "What does that mean?" she asked, her young voice barely above a whisper. "It means," Dr. Hernandez continued, "that Captain could be trained to help you achieve a state of deep relaxation on command. Not just comfort, but a genuine reset of your nervous system. I'm talking about teaching you a command, a gesture and a word, that, when executed, would signal Captain to enter a state of such profound calm that it would naturally induce calm in you as well." Over the following 6 months, Emma became a fixture at the Pacific Coast Service Dogs Foundation. She attended sessions 3 times a week after school, and her mother often remarked that these were the only times she saw her daughter truly at peace. The training wasn't what Emma had expected. There were no tricks, no performances, no sit-stay-play sequences. Instead, the work was deeply introspective and meditative. Dr. Hernandez began by teaching Emma about her own nervous system. He explained the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic branch that triggered her fight or flight response during panic attacks, and the parasympathetic branch that controlled her ability to calm down and feel safe. He taught her about neurochemicals, about how fear activated the amygdala in her brain, and how safety activated the prefrontal cortex. He explained that Captain could become a biological tool for helping her shift between these states. The training of Captain was equally methodical. Dr. Hernandez worked with Emma to identify a specific hand gesture and a whispered word that would become the signal for what he called the silence protocol. The gesture was subtle, a specific pattern of movements with the right hand that mimicked the motion of water rippling outward from a stone dropped in a pond. The word was equally subtle. Serenity, whispered so softly that only Captain could hear it. Once they'd established the signal, the real training began. Dr. Hernandez would work with Captain in specially designed sessions where the dog would be gradually conditioned to associate that gesture and word with a deeply meditative state. He used biofeedback equipment to monitor the dog's heart rate, breathing, and even brainwave patterns. Over weeks, Captain's body began to learn that when he received that command, his entire nervous system should shift into a parasympathetic dominant state, the deepest relaxation possible. But the genius of Dr. Hernandez's work was that he also trained Emma to enter this state simultaneously. During their sessions, Emma would sit beside Captain, and when Dr. Hernandez gave the signal, both human and dog would move together into this profound calm. Emma learned to match Captain's breathing, to feel the slowing of her own heartbeat, to experience the neurochemical shift in her own brain as it moved from anxiety to peace. What you're learning, Dr. Hernandez had explained during one particularly powerful session, is that your nervous system can be regulated. It's not random. It's not out of your control. You have the ability to shift your own state when you learn the right tool, and Captain becomes that tool. When you give him this command, he's not just becoming calm. He's creating an energy field of calm that your brain naturally resonates with. The training had a profound effect on Emma that went far beyond the courtroom chaos she would later face. In school, when she felt anxiety beginning to rise, she could excuse herself to the bathroom, give Captain the subtle command, and find herself anchored back to safety within minutes. At night, when nightmares threatened, she could whisper the word to her sleeping dog, and somehow, feeling his body relax beside her, she could find her way back to peace. The command became her anchor, her lifeline, her secret superpower. But Emma never told anyone about it, not her friends at school, not her extended family, not even her father during their occasional visits. The training felt sacred, intimate, like something meant only for her and Captain. Dr. Hernandez had been clear about this in their final sessions before the custody hearing. This command, Emma, is your emergency tool. Use it only when you genuinely need it, when you're in a moment so difficult that you need your nervous system to reset. It's not meant for parties or demonstrations. It's meant for moments of true crisis. Emma had nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of responsibility he was placing in her hands. She'd practiced the gesture and the word thousands of times, so that it had become automatic, encoded into her muscle memory at the deepest level. She could execute it perfectly even in a moment of extreme stress. Captain could respond to it even in the midst of his own anxiety. The bond they'd built over 6 months had created something that transcended the normal relationship between girl and dog. As Emma sat in that courtroom 6 months later, watching her family implode, she would remember Dr. Hernandez's words, "For moments of true crisis." And she would understand that this moment where her father and mother were destroying each other, where Captain was panicking, where she herself was drowning, this was exactly the kind of moment he'd been preparing her for. The training had been preparation for an emergency she hadn't yet known she would face. But now, with her nervous system screaming in panic and her beloved dog mirroring her distress, Emma would discover whether 6 months of dedicated training could actually do what Dr. Hernandez had promised. Create a moment of profound silence and calm in the midst of absolute chaos. The knowledge of this power existed within her now. The ability was encoded in her nervous system, in her bond with Captain, in the hundreds of practice sessions that had taught her body what to do when her mind was overwhelmed. She just didn't yet know she was about to use it. Time seemed to move differently in moments of extreme crisis. Emma later couldn't quite explain it, how everything had slowed down, how she'd managed to think clearly when her body was screaming in panic, how she'd found the strength to act when every part of her wanted to collapse into the floor and disappear. But in that fractional moment when she realized that both she and Captain were drowning, when she understood that the chaos surrounding them was escalating beyond any point of return, something shifted inside her. It was as if a different part of her brain had taken over, the part that Dr. Hernandez had been training for 6 months, the part that knew what to do when everything else failed. Emma's mother was still crying, her voice now almost unrecognizable with the depth of her despair. "He threatened to take her away from me," she was screaming at Judge Chen. "He said he'd make sure I never saw her again. Is that not emotional abuse? Is that not threatening behavior worthy of this court's intervention?" Emma's father had turned his back on his ex-wife, now directing his rage at his attorney. "I want supervised visitation completely revoked," he was shouting. "I want full custody. I want this psychological warfare to stop." Gerald Thompson, the attorney, was now on his feet, his face flushed with the adrenaline of the confrontation. "Your Honor, my client deserves." Judge Chen's gavel came down so hard that it actually cracked slightly against the wooden bench. The sound was like a gunshot, and it might have commanded attention if the emotional intensity in the room hadn't already far exceeded the power of any physical noise. Her voice, when she spoke, was sharp but increasingly desperate. "I will hold you all in contempt of court if this behavior continues. I am ordering immediate recess." But nobody moved. The momentum of the emotional explosion had carried everyone past the point where they could simply stop and compose themselves. It was like a boulder rolling down a mountain. Once it had started, there was no halting its descent. Captain's whimpering had become almost constant now, a high-pitched, desperate sound that Emma barely registered consciously, but that cut through her panic like a knife. The dog was packing in circles, his coordination beginning to suffer from his own overwhelming anxiety. His nails were clicking frantically against the polished courtroom floor in a rhythm that matched the frantic beating of Emma's heart. She could see the whites of his eyes now, could feel the tremor running through his muscular body whenever their contact broke for even a moment. Dr. Sarah Chen had fully left her seat in the gallery now and was moving toward Emma, her professional training overriding her respect for courtroom protocol. "Emma, honey, we need to get you out of here," the therapist was saying, reaching for the girl's arm. But Emma barely heard her. There was a strange clarity descending over her, like she was watching everything from a distance, like she was observing this chaos from underwater, muffled and surreal. She looked at Captain, really looked at him, into his dark brown eyes that were so full of fear and confusion and desperation. She saw her own panic reflected back at her, saw how her anxiety had infected him, how his response had then amplified her own state. The cycle was feeding on itself, growing exponentially, becoming unsustainable. Her chest was so tight she could barely breathe. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. And then, in that moment of absolute extremity, Emma remembered something Dr. Hernandez had said during their final training session. "The command works best when you need it most, Emma. When everything feels impossible, when you're drowning, that's when it has the most power. Because you'll give it with complete conviction, with absolute certainty, with your entire being focused on creating that shift." Emma closed her eyes for just one breath. One single breath where she blocked out the courtroom, the noise, the chaos, the panic. In that breath she centered herself. She felt the solid weight of Captain beside her. She accessed that place deep inside where she and the dog were connected at a level beyond words, beyond logic, beyond the conscious mind. She found the space inside herself where 6 months of training had created pathways and neural connections designed specifically for this moment. Her right hand began to move. The gesture was subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye. It was the pattern Dr. Hernandez had taught her, the rippling motion of water moving outward from a central point. Her fingers traced through the air with a grace and precision that belied the panic that still gripped her body. The movement took perhaps 2 seconds, and it was so quiet, so controlled, so intentional, that it seemed to create a kind of center point in the chaos. And then, so softly that only Captain's ears could hear it, Emma whispered the word, "Serenity." What happened in the next instant defied logical explanation. Captain's entire body transformed. His racing heartbeat seemed to audibly slow. His panting breath became deep and measured. His anxious packing stopped mid-step, and he lowered himself to the courtroom floor with a grace and control that seemed almost choreographed. His legs folded beneath him. His body settled into a position of perfect, absolute rest. His head came to rest gently against the cool floor, his eyes closing slightly, not in sleep, but in something deeper, a kind of profound meditative state that was almost visible in the shift of his entire being. But that was only the beginning, because something extraordinary happened next. The moment Captain's nervous system shifted, the entire room seemed to shift with it. It was like someone had turned down the volume on a stereo that had been blaring at full volume. The effect wasn't just the absence of the dog's anxiety. It was the creation of a palpable field of calm that seemed to emanate outward from where Captain now rested. Neurologically, what was happening was that the dog's body was releasing neurochemicals associated with deep relaxation, oxytocin, endorphins, and serotonin, that other mammals in the vicinity could actually detect and respond to. But to everyone in the courtroom, it felt like something almost supernatural. Emma's mother was mid-sentence when the transformation occurred. Her voice simply stopped, not because she'd consciously chosen to stop speaking, but because her nervous system, already depleted from the emotional exertion, suddenly found itself in the presence of such profound calm that her body couldn't help but respond. Her mouth remained open for a moment, her expression still angry, but the sound had died in her throat. She slowly lowered herself back into her seat. Emma's father had been gesticulating wildly, his face still red with rage, when he noticed the transformation. His hands slowly lowered. His expression shifted from fury to confusion to something that looked almost like recognition, the recognition that something extraordinary had just occurred in front of him. Gerald Thompson, mid-speech, had his words literally die on his lips. He turned to look at the girl and her dog, and for the first time his predatory expression cracked, revealing something more human underneath. Judge Patricia Chen had raised her gavel for what would have been another futile strike, but her hand froze in midair. Her stern, exhausted expression softened as she observed the scene before her. The gavel slowly lowered. Her eyes, which had been flashing with judicial authority moments before, now reflected something like awe. The silence that fell over the courtroom wasn't the absence of sound, though the room was perfectly quiet. It was the presence of something. It was the palpable reality of profound calm, of nervous systems simultaneously downshifting from crisis to peace, of a collective exhalation after everyone had been holding their breath. It was a silence that was almost audible in its intensity, a silence that seemed to have weight and presence and meaning. Mrs. Henderson, the court clerk, had her hand frozen above her stenotype machine. Her eyes had filled with tears, though she couldn't quite explain why. In her 30 years of courtroom service, she had never witnessed anything remotely like this. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been moving toward Emma moments before, had stopped mid-step. Her professional training recognized exactly what was happening, a genuine nervous system reset occurring in real time in everyone present. She slowly lowered herself back into her seat, her eyes never leaving the girl and the dog. Emma remained exactly as she was, her hand still extended in the final position of the gesture, her body still trembling slightly from the exertion of what she'd just done, her eyes still closed. But the trembling was different now. It wasn't panic. It was the release of built-up tension, like a string that had been wound impossibly tight suddenly being allowed to vibrate freely. The silence held. Seconds passed, then more seconds. The world seemed to have stopped spinning. The courtroom seemed to exist in a bubble outside of normal time and space. Everyone in that room, from the judge to the bailiff to the spectators in the gallery to the two parents who moments before had been locked in vicious combat, seemed to have been transported to a place beyond anger, beyond conflict, beyond the human capacity for cruelty. It was the moment everything changed. It was the moment when a 12-year-old girl, pushed to the absolute edge of her breaking point, had wielded a power she barely understood. And in wielding that power, she had accomplished something that no amount of legal argument, judicial authority, or adult reasoning could have achieved. She had created silence. True, profound, sacred silence. Judge Patricia Chen remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 30 seconds. Her gavel was still held loosely in her right hand, suspended in the air as if she'd forgotten it was there. Her eyes, sharp and analytical after 30 years of judicial service, were fixed on the girl and her dog. She was observing something, analyzing something, trying to understand what had just occurred in her courtroom, something that didn't fit into any legal precedent, any courtroom protocol, any rational framework she'd been trained to apply. Emma sat perfectly still in the final position of the silence protocol, though her body was beginning to tremble slightly from the physical and emotional exertion. Captain remained in his state of profound calm, his breathing slow and rhythmic, his entire being radiating a peace so complete that it seemed almost impossible he'd been in the throes of anxiety moments before. The two of them, girl and dog, appeared almost statue-like, as if they existed in a different dimension from the rest of the courtroom. Emma's mother had sunk into her chair, her hands covering her face, but her shoulders weren't shaking with sobs anymore. There was a strange stillness to her now, a quality of shock mixed with something almost like relief. Her breathing had slowed. Her nervous system, activated to the point of breaking moments before, had responded to the profound calm radiating from Captain as if someone had manually switched off her fight-or-flight response. Emma's father stood at his table, his face no longer red, his anger seeming to have drained out of him like water from a broken vessel. He was staring at his daughter with an expression that was difficult to read, confusion, wonder, shame, recognition, all mixed together. His hands, which moments before had been clenched into fists, were now hanging loosely at his sides. Gerald Thompson had lowered himself slowly back into his chair, his sharp, predatory expression completely gone. He looked like a different man, stripped of his aggressive posturing, reduced to something more fundamentally human. He was observing Emma with an intensity that suggested something fundamental had shifted in his perception. The courtroom remained absolutely silent. Mrs. Henderson, the court clerk, had tears streaming silently down her face, though she appeared to have no conscious awareness of them. In her 30 years of service, she had seen judges sentence people to death, had witnessed families destroyed by custody battles, had observed the full spectrum of human suffering that the legal system encompassed. But she had never witnessed anything like this. A child wielding a power that transcended the entire machinery of the law, that reached past legal arguments straight into the nervous systems of everyone present. Dr. Sarah Chen, Emma's therapist, had her hands pressed together against her mouth, her professional composure completely shattered. She recognized exactly what she was witnessing, a nervous system intervention so profound, so perfectly executed, that it had created a simultaneous shift in everyone's parasympathetic activation. She understood, on a neurological level, what had just happened, but understanding it didn't make it any less extraordinary. Judge Chen's hand finally lowered. She placed the gavel carefully on her bench as if it had become fragile, precious, dangerous. She removed her reading glasses slowly and set them down beside the gavel. Then she folded her hands in front of her and closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, something fundamental had changed in her expression. The stern judicial authority that had defined her demeanor was still present, but it was now tempered by something else: humanity, compassion, perhaps even recognition of something she couldn't quite articulate. She stood up slowly from her elevated bench and looked directly at Emma. "Young lady," she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft, "I don't understand what just occurred here, but I recognize its significance." She paused, collecting her thoughts, and Emma could see that the judge was genuinely struggling with how to respond to a situation that was completely outside her legal training and courtroom experience. "I am going to take a brief recess." But before I do, I need to speak with both counsel immediately. In my chambers, now." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with absolute authority, but the tone was different from how Judge Chen had been speaking before the transformation. There was a contemplative quality to her voice now, a kind of reverence even. She turned to address the courtroom at large. "This courtroom will observe a period of silence and reflection. No one is to speak. No one is to move. We will reconvene in exactly 20 minutes." The bailiff, a large man who typically looked stern and unmoved, simply nodded. There was no need for him to call out the traditional recess announcement. The silence itself was the recess. Judge Chen descended from her bench and walked directly toward Emma. The girl's heart began racing again, but this time it was different. This wasn't panic, but rather the nervous response of a child confronted by an authority figure. Emma looked up at the judge with wide eyes, uncertain what was about to happen. Judge Chen knelt down to Emma's level, an extraordinary breach of courtroom protocol. Judges did not kneel. Judges did not position themselves at the same height as courtroom participants. Judges maintained their elevated perspective, both literally and figuratively. But Judge Chen was doing exactly that. "What is your name, child?" the judge asked gently. "Emma," the girl whispered. "Emma Martinez." Judge Chen's eyes moved to Captain, who lifted his head slightly at the attention but remained in his state of profound calm. "And this is your service dog?" "Yes," Emma said. "His name is Captain." Judge Chen reached out slowly and placed a gentle hand on Captain's head. The dog accepted the touch without moving, without breaking the meditative state he'd entered. The judge closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, they were glistening with tears. "You are an extraordinary young woman, Emma," Judge Chen said quietly. "What you did just now, I don't fully understand it, but I recognize that it was remarkable. And I recognize that you did it out of necessity, out of desperation, out of a kind of wisdom that most adults never develop." Emma didn't know what to say. She'd expected the judge to be angry that she'd somehow disrupted the courtroom proceedings. She hadn't expected this response, this kneeling, this gentleness, this apparent recognition of something profound. Judge Chen stood up and looked at both of Emma's parents. "Both of you," she said, her voice carrying renewed authority but tempered with something almost like sorrow, "just witnessed your daughter demonstrate emotional maturity and wisdom that most human beings never achieve. I want you both to understand, in this moment, that whatever anger you have for each other pales in comparison to what this child has just shown us about what matters in life." Emma's mother was openly sobbing now, but not with the rage she'd been expressing moments before. These were tears of shame, recognition, and grief for what her conflict with her husband had cost her daughter. Emma's father had turned away, his shoulders shaking, his own tears flowing silently down his face. "I am going to speak with counsel," Judge Chen continued, "and we are going to find a way to resolve this matter that serves this child's interests and her emotional well-being, not the ego and anger of her parents. Is that clear?" Both attorneys nodded mutely. Judge Chen turned back to Emma one more time. "You may remain here with your dog and with your therapist if you wish, or you may return to the gallery, but I want you to know something, Emma Martinez. Today in this courtroom, you changed something. You changed the energy in this room. You changed something in all of us. And I believe you changed something in the law itself, because you've demonstrated that there are forms of wisdom and power that exist beyond what our legal system typically recognizes." The judge began to walk toward her chambers, then stopped and turned back once more. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a weight of absolute conviction. "I am going to issue an order regarding what occurred here today in this courtroom. I am going to order that no one is permitted to discuss or make public statements about what happened with this child and her dog. This moment, this sacred moment, deserves to be protected. It deserves to exist beyond the reach of media sensationalism, public curiosity, or legal commentary. This order stands as a matter of judicial authority and moral imperative." She paused, her eyes meeting Emma's one final time. "Your secret is safe with me, Emma, and it will remain secret, protected by the full authority of this court." With that, Judge Chen turned and walked toward her chambers, her attorneys hurrying behind her in confusion and astonishment. Emma sat in the courtroom gallery, surrounded by the profound silence that continued to hold everyone in its grip. She didn't yet understand the significance of what the judge had said. She didn't yet know that this moment, this decision by Judge Chen to protect the secret of what had occurred, would set off a chain reaction of events that would capture the world's imagination and challenge everything people believed about the power of service dogs, the wisdom of children, and the transformative potential of genuine human-animal bonds. All she knew in that moment was that something fundamental had shifted. The courtroom that had been a battleground moments before was now a sanctuary, and her father and mother, whatever happened next, would never again be able to ignore what their daughter was trying to teach them about what truly mattered in life. The silence continued, and in that silence, healing had already begun. The secret lasted exactly 4 hours and 37 minutes. By all accounts, the leak came from one of the most unlikely sources, not from a journalist, not from a court observer, not from any of the attorneys or official courtroom personnel who understood the gravity of Judge Chen's order. It came from a paralegal named Marcus Thompson, who worked in Gerald Thompson's law office. Marcus had been sitting in the courtroom gallery, observing the custody hearing as part of his professional development. He'd witnessed the transformation, had felt the profound shift in the room's energy, and had been just as affected as everyone else. But Marcus was also a millennial who, by habit and necessity, documented his entire life on social media. Within an hour of leaving the courthouse, sitting in his car in the parking lot, his hands shaking from the emotional intensity of what he'd witnessed, Marcus had opened his Instagram account and typed out a single message. "Just witnessed something impossible in court today. A girl and her dog." The entire room went silent. Changed everything. "Can't say more, but the world needs to know this is real. Service dog miracle courtroom magic, something happened." He posted it without thinking about the legal implications, without considering the judge's explicit order, without recognizing that he was about to ignite a wildfire that would consume the internet and the attention of millions. Within 30 minutes, the post had been shared 200 times. Within an hour, it had been shared 5,000 times. By evening, it had gone viral. The comments section exploded with speculation. "What happened? Tell us. This is fake. No way this is real. I need to know more." Conspiracy theorists began crafting elaborate narratives. Service dog trainers started theorizing about advanced training techniques. Animal behaviorists weighed in with pseudoscientific explanations. Spiritual practitioners claimed it was evidence of psychic abilities. UFO enthusiasts suggested alien technology. Every possible interpretation, every wild theory, every unfounded speculation began circulating at lightning speed. By the next morning, mainstream news outlets had picked up the story. "Viral video claims service dog can command silence in courtroom," read one headline. "Girl's dog silences angry courtroom. Here's what scientists say," read another. "Mysterious courtroom moment sparks global speculation," announced a third. The story had no facts, no verified information, no actual details about what had occurred, but it had something far more compelling in the age of social media: mystery, intrigue, and the powerful human need to understand the inexplicable. By Thursday morning, news vans were camped outside Riverside County Superior Court. Reporters with perfectly coiffed hair and tailored suits stood in front of cameras, breathlessly describing what they called the incident, despite having absolutely no concrete information about it. Legal analysts appeared on morning shows speculating wildly about courtroom procedure violations. Pet experts discussed service dog training capabilities. Psychologists theorized about human-animal bonding. Emma Martinez had no idea any of this was happening. She was at school, sitting in her 7th period English class, completely unaware that her name and face, pulled from her school directory and social media profiles, were beginning to circulate across news networks and internet platforms. Her mother, who worked from home as a graphic designer, discovered the explosion when her phone began ringing with calls from unknown numbers. Her father, who typically checked social media only occasionally, was astonished to find his own name mentioned in dozens of articles and forum discussions. Dr. Sarah Chen, Emma's therapist, received a call from her clinic's receptionist. Dr. Chen, "We're getting calls from reporters asking about Emma Martinez. They're saying something about a courtroom incident. There are news vans outside the building." By Friday morning, Emma's school was in chaos. Parents were arriving to pick up their children. Reporters were trying to gain access to the campus. The school administration issued a statement. Riverside Middle School will not be commenting on any student-related incidents. The privacy and safety of our students is our top priority. Emma's mother pulled her out of school early. "We need to protect your privacy," she'd said, her face pale with stress. "Whatever is happening out there, you need to be safe." Judge Patricia Chen issued a press statement through her office. "A court order has been issued regarding the confidentiality of certain proceedings. I will not be discussing any details of cases under my jurisdiction. I trust that the public will respect the legal authority of the court and the privacy of the individuals involved." But the more the official channels tried to contain the story, the more it exploded. The void of actual information created a perfect vacuum that the internet rushed to fill with speculation, theory, conspiracy, and wild imagination. People who had nothing to do with the original incident began claiming they knew what had happened. Online forums dedicated to the courtroom miracle sprang up. Fan art appeared showing Emma and Captain in heroic poses. Memes circulated making fun of the hysteria. T-shirts were printed. Hashtags proliferated. Silence Protocol Court Magic Emma Martinez Captain the Dog. Emma's Instagram account, which she'd created mostly to follow her friends and look at dog videos, suddenly had 50,000 followers. People were messaging her constantly, begging for information, offering money for interviews, making wild accusations. Her Facebook account was flooded with friend requests. Her Snapchat exploded with notifications. Her father, despite their ongoing custody dispute, called her mother with genuine concern. "Have you seen what's happening online? People are claiming Emma has psychic powers. Some are saying she's in danger. We need to do something to protect her." Her mother, for the first time in months, agreed with him completely. "I know. I'm scared. She's just a 12-year-old girl and the entire internet is obsessed with her now." By Sunday, national news networks were leading with the story. CNN ran a segment titled "The Mystery Service Dog." Fox News discussed the unexplained courtroom incident. MSNBC analyzed the legal implications of Judge Chen's confidentiality order. The story had transcended the local and regional level and become a genuine national phenomenon. Dr. Michael Hernandez, director of the Pacific Coast Service Dogs Foundation, began receiving calls from media outlets, other trainers, researchers, and people claiming they wanted to understand the secret that Emma and Captain had supposedly discovered. He released a careful statement. "The Pacific Coast Service Dogs Foundation takes the privacy and confidentiality of our clients and their service dog partnerships very seriously. We will not be commenting on any specific cases or partnerships. We are, however, available to discuss the science of service dog training in general terms." That single statement, instead of quieting the speculation, actually intensified it. If Dr. Hernandez wasn't denying something had happened, people reasoned, then it must be real. If he wasn't explaining the mystery, then the mystery must be profound and perhaps even dangerous to reveal. The fact that he was protecting confidentiality only reinforced the belief that something extraordinary had occurred. Online communities began forming. Reddit threads multiplied. TikTok creators made videos theorizing about what Emma's command might have been. YouTube channels dedicated to analyzing every scrap of information about the incident began uploading daily videos. A podcast called The Silence Protocol launched, with hosts speculating endlessly about what had happened in that courtroom. Emma's mother made a decision. They would hire a lawyer specializing in media law and privacy protection. They would not grant any interviews. They would not engage with any media requests. They would protect their daughter's privacy at any cost. But the cost was becoming impossible to bear. Emma couldn't go to the grocery store without being recognized. She couldn't attend school without becoming a spectacle. She couldn't walk her dog without people stopping her, asking questions, wanting to know the secret. Her life had been completely transformed overnight, and she'd done nothing except what she had to do in the moment of crisis. The irony was bitter. In trying to escape the chaos and noise of her parents' custody battle, Emma had inadvertently created an infinitely larger chaos. What Judge Chen had tried to protect through her court order, the sacred silence and privacy of that moment, had become the subject of global obsession and speculation. By the following Wednesday, exactly 1 week after the courtroom incident, TMZ published an article claiming they'd found evidence that Emma Martinez had been in a special service dog training program. By Thursday, Page 6 reported that the program was allegedly classified and top secret. By Friday, a conspiracy theory website claimed that the Department of Defense was involved in some kind of mind control experiment. Emma sat in her room, Captain lying beside her, and gave her dog the silence protocol command. Not because she was in crisis, but because she needed to escape the one thing she couldn't escape, the world's obsession with a secret she wasn't even sure she understood herself. And in that moment of profound calm that she and Captain created together, she wished more than anything that she could give the entire world this command, that she could whisper the word and still all the noise, all the speculation, all the relentless hunger to know a mystery that was supposed to have remained sacred and silent. But the damage was already done. The secret was out, exposed not in its truth but in 1,000 distorted reflections of itself. And Emma Martinez, 12 years old, would have to figure out how to live in a world that had decided she was the most interesting person on the internet, for reasons she couldn't control and a truth she couldn't explain. Dr. Michael Hernandez sat in his office at the Pacific Coast Service Dogs Foundation, surrounded by walls lined with academic journals, training manuals, photographs of successful service dog placements, and awards from veterinary and psychological organizations. He was monitoring the media frenzy with a mixture of concern and professional fascination. In his 35 years of working with service dogs, he had never witnessed anything quite like this, a moment of genuine human-animal bonding that had been so distorted by the internet and media speculation that the truth had become almost unrecognizable. He received calls constantly. News producers wanted him on their shows. Researchers wanted to collaborate. Other trainers wanted to know his methods. Desperate people with anxiety disorders wanted to enroll their dogs in the mysterious silence protocol. He'd been turning down interview requests for 3 days, knowing that any statement he made would only fuel more speculation. But on Thursday evening, as he was reviewing training videos and preparing for the next day's sessions, Dr. Hernandez made a decision that would shift the entire narrative around what had happened in Judge Chen's courtroom. He contacted Judge Chen directly at her home, a breach of typical protocol but necessary given the circumstances. "Your Honor, I need to speak with you about Emma Martinez and what's happening with the public reaction to the courtroom incident," he said when she answered. Judge Chen listened as Dr. Hernandez explained his concerns. The misinformation was spreading faster than facts could ever hope to correct it. People were making wild claims about Emma possessing supernatural abilities. There were conspiracy theories gaining traction online. The young girl's life was being invaded by people who wanted her to be something she wasn't. the genuine achievement, a combination of rigorous training and authentic human-animal bonding, was being obscured by sensationalism and pseudoscience. "What do you suggest?" Judge Chen asked, her judicial mind immediately recognizing that the situation required intervention. "I believe I should speak publicly about service dog training and the science of what occurred," Dr. Hernandez said carefully. "Not about Emma specifically, and not about the case details. But I could provide educational context that might help people understand that what happened was remarkable, yes, but not magical. It was the result of dedication, training, and genuine human-animal connection. These are things that can be understood scientifically." Judge Chen was quiet for a moment. "Would speaking out violate your obligations to client confidentiality?" "Only if I discuss specifics of Emma's case or Captain's training," Dr. Hernandez replied. "If I speak generally about service dog training and therapeutic protocols, I'm providing education without breaching confidentiality." Judge Chen made her decision. "Dr. Hernandez, I'm going to allow you to speak publicly, with the understanding that you will not discuss any specific details of the Martinez case or this particular service dog partnership. But I believe the public deserves to understand what they're witnessing, not from a place of sensationalism, but from scientific knowledge. You have my permission and my encouragement to provide that perspective." By Friday morning, Dr. Michael Hernandez was conducting his first media interview with NPR's science correspondent. His approach was methodical and educational. He didn't deny that something extraordinary had occurred. He didn't claim to know exactly what Emma had done, but he provided a framework for understanding how it was possible. "Service dogs undergo thousands of hours of training," he explained, his voice calm and professorial. "They're trained to recognize microexpressions, changes in heart rate, alterations in breathing patterns, and other physiological signals that human beings don't consciously notice. Dogs are remarkably sensitive to the neurochemical states of their human companions." "But can a dog really command an entire room to be silent?" the interviewer asked. "Not in the way the internet seems to be suggesting," Dr. Hernandez replied. "What I believe happened is that a service dog, responding to a specific command from their handler, entered a state of profound relaxation. When a dog achieves that state, their body releases neurochemicals, oxytocin, endorphins, serotonin, that other mammals can actually detect. The human nervous system can respond to these chemical signals. So essentially, the dog's deep calm was creating an environment that was neurologically conducive to calm in the humans around them." "So it's real, but it's not magic," the interviewer said. "Exactly," Dr. Hernandez confirmed. "It's neurobiology. It's the result of careful training. It's the power of human-animal bonding. But it's not supernatural, and it's not something to be feared or sensationalized. It's something to be appreciated and understood." Over the following week, Dr. Hernandez gave a series of interviews to major media outlets, academic publications, and science-focused platforms. Each time, he provided the same educational framework while carefully avoiding any specifics about Emma or Captain. He spoke about the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. He discussed how trauma affects the nervous system and how service dogs could help regulate nervous system responses. On the podcast, The Infinite Mind, he explained, "What we're witnessing is the application of modern neuroscience to the ancient relationship between humans and animals. Dogs have been helping humans for thousands of years, but we're only now beginning to understand the neurological mechanisms of why that relationship is so powerful." On a TED Talk that garnered 2 million views in its first week, he said, "Service dogs are not miraculous. They are biological tools that have been refined through careful training and understanding of canine and human neurology. The bond between a human and a service dog is not supernatural. It is one of the most profound forms of biological communication available to us." His appearance on a scientific podcast focused on trauma and neuroscience was particularly influential. Dr. Hernandez discussed the research on how animals could help regulate human nervous systems, citing peer-reviewed studies and neuroimaging data. He explained how a person with PTSD or anxiety disorder could use a service dog as a biological anchor, a way to access parasympathetic activation when their own nervous system had been damaged by trauma. The girl in this courtroom situation, he said carefully, likely underwent years of therapeutic work, both with a mental health professional and with her service dog. She developed skills and tools for managing her own nervous system. When she reached a moment of crisis, she accessed those tools. That's not a miracle. That's therapy working exactly as it's supposed to work. The impact of Dr. Hernandez's interventions was profound and measurable. The conspiracy theories didn't disappear entirely. Conspiracy theories never do. But they were increasingly drowned out by scientific voices providing actual information. The sensational headlines were supplemented by educational articles. The memes and fan art continued, but they were joined by serious discussions about service dog training and mental health support. Most importantly, Dr. Hernandez's willingness to speak publicly created a permission structure for other experts to join the conversation. Neuroscientists began publishing papers about human-animal bonding. Mental health professionals wrote articles about service dogs as therapeutic tools. Trauma specialists discussed the neurobiological mechanisms of how animals could help humans heal. The narrative shifted from mysterious miracle to remarkable example of science and training working together. Emma's school received an email from a neuroscience researcher at UC San Diego requesting permission to conduct educational sessions about service dogs and mental health. A mental health advocacy organization contacted Emma's mother asking if Emma would be willing to participate in a documentary about service dogs as therapeutic tools. The National Alliance on Mental Illness wanted to feature Emma's story as an example of how young people could advocate for their own mental health needs. But Emma was still just 12 years old. She still wanted to be able to go to school without being recognized. She still wanted to play with her friends without constant questions about captain's training. She still wanted some semblance of a normal childhood. The fact that the conversation had shifted from sensationalism to science didn't change the fundamental reality that her privacy had been invaded, her secret had been exposed, and her life had been permanently altered. However, Dr. Hernandez's intervention did accomplish something crucial. It reclaimed the narrative from pure speculation and placed it in the realm of scientific understanding. It prevented the internet from turning Emma into a supernatural figure or a subject of ridicule. It created space for her to eventually tell her own story, if and when she chose to, from a position of strength rather than from a position of being hunted by a sensationalizing media. Most importantly, Dr. Hernandez's speaking out created a framework for understanding that service dogs weren't mystical creatures or psychological crutches. They were sophisticated biological tools that worked through verifiable neurological mechanisms. He shifted the conversation from, "What is this impossible thing?" to, "How does this remarkable but understandable thing work?" And in doing so, he gave Emma Martinez back something precious: the right to be a normal girl with a service dog, rather than a girl with supernatural powers who had somehow commanded silence in a courtroom through means beyond human understanding. The mystery remained. People still didn't know the exact nature of Emma's command, the specific training she'd received, the precise technique she'd used. But the fear and sensationalism around that mystery had been substantially reduced. It had been transformed from the inexplicable into the scientifically explainable. And that transformation, subtle as it might seem, was profoundly important for a 12-year-old girl trying to survive in a world that had become obsessed with her. The mediation session began on a Tuesday morning in a neutral office space in downtown San Diego, not in the courthouse, but in a comfortable, professionally designed conference room decorated with soft colors and comfortable furniture, meant to encourage calm conversation rather than adversarial confrontation. The mediator, Dr. James Wilson, was a highly respected professional with 20 years of experience helping families navigate custody disputes and divorce conflicts. He'd been assigned to the Martinez case by Judge Chen with a specific instruction: find a way to help this family remember what matters. Emma sat in a waiting room with her therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, and her mother. She'd been dreading this day, imagining another confrontation, another explosion of anger and accusations. But something had shifted in her mother over the past 2 weeks. The viral story, the media attention, the realization of how her conflict with Emma's father had affected her daughter, it had created a kind of awakening. "Whatever happens today," Emma's mother said, taking her daughter's hand, "I want you to know that I'm doing this for you, not to fight your father, not to win, but to try to find a way for this to be better for you." Emma nodded, feeling the genuine shift in her mother's energy. Something had broken open inside Isabella Martinez, not in the destructive way she'd broken open in the courtroom, but in a healing way. The sight of her daughter commanding that profound silence, the realization that Emma had been pushed to such an extreme point by the parents' conflict, had shattered something in Isabella's defensive walls. Across the building, in a similar waiting room, Emma's father sat with his attorney, Gerald Thompson. But Robert Martinez was a different man than the one who'd been screaming accusations in the courtroom 3 weeks prior. He'd spent those 3 weeks watching the viral videos, reading Dr. Hernandez's scientific explanations, and most importantly, sitting with his own shame and regret. He'd finally allowed himself to understand that his ex-wife had been telling the truth about some of his behavior. His rage at losing control of his life after the divorce had manifested as attempts to control his ex-wife, to prove her wrong, to reclaim power in the one arena, his daughter, where he still had leverage. And in doing so, he'd hurt the one person he genuinely loved most, Emma. The realization had come to him late one night while watching a segment on the news where Dr. Hernandez discussed how trauma affects children. The expert had talked about how children of conflicted divorces often develop anxiety disorders, how they internalize their parents' conflicts, how they sometimes developed what was called parentification, taking on emotional responsibility for their parents' well-being. And Robert had recognized his own daughter in that description. Emma had been trying to manage her parents' emotions, trying to be the peacekeeper, trying to hold her fractured family together. And her anxiety disorder, her PTSD from the car accident, these had been exacerbated by the constant warfare between her parents. The realization had broken something open in Robert. He'd sat alone in his apartment and cried, not angry tears, but tears of genuine remorse and recognition of how profoundly he'd failed the person he loved most. When Dr. Wilson brought both parties into the mediation room, the energy was different than it had been in the courtroom. Robert sat down across from Isabella, and for the first time in months, he really looked at her, not as an adversary or an ex-wife to defeat, but as a human being who had also been struggling. "I need to say something," Robert said, his voice steady but trembling with emotion. He looked directly at Isabella. "I owe you an apology, more than an apology. I've been using this custody battle as a way to hurt you because I was hurt. And in doing that, I've hurt Emma. I can see that now, I understand it, and I'm deeply sorry." Isabella's eyes filled with tears. This was not what she'd expected. She'd prepared for argument, for more accusations, for the typical adversarial custody battle dynamics. Robert continued, his voice becoming stronger. "I watched the videos from the courtroom. I watched our daughter do something extraordinary because she was desperate to create peace. And I realized that I'm the one who pushed her to that point. My anger, my need to be right, my inability to accept that our marriage ended and move on. I did that." Dr. Wilson, the mediator, remained professionally neutral, but Emma could imagine he was witnessing something rare, a genuine moment of accountability and recognition in a custody dispute. "What I want," Robert said, looking now at Dr. Wilson and then back at Isabella, "is to figure out a custody arrangement that serves Emma's well-being. Not my needs, not my ego, her well-being. Whatever that looks like, I'm willing to do it." Isabella, who had prepared herself for battle, found that the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her defensive posture crumbled. "I don't want to fight anymore either," she said quietly. "I've been so angry at you, and so much of that anger was justified. But I've also been using our conflict with Emma as my emotional support, and that's not fair to her. She's a child. She shouldn't have to manage our emotions." Dr. Wilson leaned forward. "What both of you are describing sounds like a genuine desire to prioritize your daughter's needs. That's actually a remarkable place to start negotiation." Over the next several hours, something unexpected happened. Instead of fighting over custody schedules and visitation rights, Robert and Isabella began talking about Emma, who she was, what she needed, what would actually serve her best interests. They discussed her anxiety, her therapy, her service dog, her need for stability and peace. They discussed how the constant conflict had affected her. They discussed, for the first time in months, their daughter as a person rather than as a possession to be fought over. "She needs consistency," Isabella said, "but she also needs to feel loved by both of us." The back and forth was making her anxious. "What if we tried something different?" Robert suggested. "What if instead of a traditional 50-50 split, we did a schedule that made more sense for her school year? Maybe she stays primarily with you during the school year because that provides more stability, and she spends extended time with me in the summers and holidays." "But you'd be actively involved during the school year," Isabella said. "Not just on weekends. You'd be there for her school events, her therapy appointments, her regular life." "Yes," Robert said. "That's what I want, not to take her away from you, but to be genuinely present in her life." Dr. Wilson listened as the conversation evolved from conflict to collaboration. By the end of the 4-hour mediation session, Robert and Isabella had negotiated a joint custody arrangement that was far more creative and child-centered than anything their attorneys would have proposed. They'd agreed to continue co-parenting counseling to help them communicate better. They'd agreed to never use Emma as a messenger between them. They'd agreed to present a united front regarding her mental health needs and her service dog. Most importantly, they'd agreed that Emma would not be discussed as a prize to be won, but as a child to be protected and supported by both parents. 3 days later, both parents met with Judge Chen in her private chambers. This was not a typical legal proceeding. It was more like a blessing, a moment of formal recognition that something important had shifted. Judge Chen sat at her desk, her hands folded in front of her, and looked at both Robert and Isabella with an expression of genuine respect. "I have reviewed the mediation agreement," she said. "I find it to be in the best interests of the child. More importantly, I believe it represents genuine cooperation and shared commitment to Emma's well-being." She paused, allowing her words to settle. "I want to speak to you as a mother, not just as a judge," Judge Chen continued. "I have presided over thousands of custody cases in my career. Many of them are contentious, bitter, destructive battles that leave children traumatized. Your case was on that path, but something changed. Your daughter changed something. She showed you, through her actions and her courage, what actually matters in life." Judge Chen's eyes grew slightly moist. "She will likely never fully understand the gift she gave you both, the opportunity to step back from your conflict and remember why you both became parents in the first place. I want you both to honor that gift by continuing to prioritize her well-being, to maintain the cooperation you've established, and to let her grow up without the burden of managing your emotions." The judge signed the modified custody agreement and officially closed the case. As Robert and Isabella stood to leave, Judge Chen called Emma's father back for a private word. "Your daughter is remarkable," Judge Chen said to Robert. "I hope you understand that, and I hope you understand the responsibility you have to protect that remarkable quality, to give her a childhood where she can just be a child, not a mediator between her warring parents." Robert, tears streaming down his face, simply nodded. 2 weeks later, Emma returned to school. She was no longer the girl everyone was obsessed with. The media had moved on to other stories. The viral moment had been replaced by the next viral moment. Life had returned to something approaching normal. But something fundamental had changed in Emma's family. Her parents still weren't together and they still had conflicts, because that's normal. But they were no longer using Emma as a battleground. They were no longer weaponizing their custody arrangement against each other. They were, for the first time since their separation, actually parenting together. Emma's mother and father attended her therapy sessions together to learn how to best support her anxiety management. They coordinated Emma's schedule so that she had the stability she needed while still maintaining deep relationships with both parents. They supported her service dog training and understood that Captain was a legitimate therapeutic tool, not a crutch or a sign of weakness. And perhaps most importantly, they both attended the Pacific Coast Service Dogs Foundation Gala when it was announced that Emma and Captain would be honored for their service dog partnership. They sat together, not as divorced enemies, but as two people united in their pride and love for their daughter. Emma, standing at the podium preparing to give her speech, looked out at her parents sitting side by side. Captain stood calmly beside her, his training and his bond with Emma evident in his perfect composure. And Emma understood, perhaps for the first time, that the silence protocol command she'd given in the courtroom had done more than silence that room. It had broken the cycle of conflict that had been consuming her family. It had created space for healing. The courtroom battle that seemed destined to continue for years had ended not because of legal arguments or judicial decisions, but because a 12-year-old girl had shown her parents what truly mattered: love, peace, and the well-being of a child. 1 year had passed since the moment in Judge Chen's courtroom. Emma Martinez stood backstage at the San Diego Convention Center, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone attached to her blazer. Captain stood beside her in his service dog vest, perfectly calm and composed, a stark contrast to the nervous energy radiating from his human companion. Despite all the preparation, despite all the practice with her therapist, despite knowing exactly what she wanted to say, Emma felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest. "You've got this," her mother whispered from the side of the stage, giving her daughter's shoulder a gentle squeeze. Her father stood on the other side, offering an encouraging nod. For the first time in Emma's life, both parents were present and unified, supporting her as a team rather than as adversaries. The auditorium was packed. The Pacific Coast Service Dogs Foundation's annual gala had attracted over 1,000 attendees, service dog handlers and their companions, trainers and behavioral specialists, mental health professionals, supporters and donors. But there were also journalists, bloggers and observers who had come specifically to see Emma Martinez, the girl who had allegedly commanded silence in a courtroom, the mysterious figure around whom an entire viral phenomenon had swirled. Emma took a deep breath. She could see Judge Patricia Chen sitting in the front row, her eyes warm and encouraging. Dr. Michael Hernandez was there as well, giving her an approving nod. Her therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, sat nearby, representing not just her professional role but her personal investment in Emma's healing journey. Even some of the court personnel from that fateful day, Mrs. Henderson, the court clerk, and others who had witnessed the moment, were in the audience. The announcer's voice boomed through the auditorium. "And now, we are honored to present this year's award for exceptional service dog partnership and emotional courage, going to Emma Martinez and her service dog, Captain." Emma walked onto the stage, Captain moving perfectly at her side. The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Some people were crying, others were cheering. Emma could feel the weight of their attention, their curiosity, their need to understand this girl who had become, whether she wanted to or not, a symbol of something transcendent. She stepped up to the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. She could see the cameras in the back, recording for news outlets and social media platforms. She understood that her words would be broadcast, analyzed, discussed, and perhaps misinterpreted. But she also understood that this was her opportunity to tell her truth, not the sensationalized version the internet had created, but the real story of a girl, a dog, and the power of genuine human-animal connection. "Thank you for this honor," Emma began, her young voice steady despite her nervousness. "When I was asked to speak today, I thought about what I wanted to say. There's so much that happened over the past year, so much noise, so much speculation, so much of other people's versions of my story. And I realized that what I really wanted to do was tell you the truth about what actually matters." She paused, looking down at Captain, who was lying calmly at her feet. Captain isn't special because he has magical powers. He's special because someone, Dr. Michael Hernandez, believed in the science of how animals can help humans heal. He's special because my therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, understood that I needed more than talk therapy to manage my anxiety. He's special because there was someone willing to invest hundreds of hours training him to be more than just a pet. He's special because he was taught to recognize when I was in crisis and to help me regulate my nervous system. Emma's voice grew stronger as she continued. "But most importantly, Captain is special because we built a real relationship. Not a magical one, a real one. I trust him completely. He's present in my life every single day. He knows when I'm anxious before I even consciously realize it. And when I need him to help me find calm, I can access that help not through some supernatural power, but through years of training and a genuine bond." The audience was completely silent, hanging on her every word. This was not the sensational story they'd been obsessed with online. This was something more honest, more real, more powerful in its ordinariness. "Something happened in a courtroom a year ago," Emma continued. "My parents were in conflict, my dog was anxious, I was having a panic attack, and I used a tool I'd been trained to use, a command that helped both me and Captain find calm. What happened next surprised everyone, including me. But what I want you to understand is that it wasn't a miracle. It was therapy working. It was training working. It was love and commitment working." Emma's eyes grew slightly moist, but her voice remained clear and controlled. "My parents have taught me something really important over the past year. They were so focused on being right, on winning our custody battle, that they almost missed what actually mattered, which was my well-being. And I had to do something extraordinary just to get them to notice. I had to push myself to my absolute breaking point." She looked directly at her parents. "I'm grateful that something shifted for them. I'm grateful they decided to work together instead of against each other. But I want to say to every adult listening, don't wait for your child to have a breakdown before you prioritize their well-being. Don't let your conflict consume the people you're supposed to be protecting." The room was completely still. Emma could see her mother wiping away tears. Her father's expression was full of emotion, regret, love, recognition. "I also want to talk about mental health," Emma continued. "I have anxiety. I have PTSD from a car accident that took my best friend's life. These are things that are real and serious, and they're also things that can be managed and treated. Having a service dog isn't a sign of weakness. Having a therapist isn't a sign of weakness. Using tools to manage your mental health is a sign of strength. It's a sign that you care about yourself enough to do the work." Emma took a breath, and for the first time she allowed herself to smile slightly. "Captain has taught me that healing isn't about being perfect or being powerful or being able to command rooms into silence. Healing is about showing up. It's about being present. It's about building real connections with other beings, whether human or animal, and letting those connections support you through the hard parts of life." She paused, looking at the audience with new confidence. "The story about me and Captain in the courtroom became famous because people wanted to believe in something extraordinary, and I understand that desire. Life is hard. We want to believe that there are magical solutions, that there are extraordinary people who can fix everything with one mysterious command. But the real truth is more beautiful than that. The real truth is that ordinary people, with support and training and love, can do extraordinary things. Not through magic, but through commitment and connection." Emma's voice grew quiet but even more powerful. Captain and I didn't silence a courtroom through anything supernatural. We created a moment of calm in the midst of chaos. And in that moment, adults were reminded of what actually matters. That's not magic. That's just what happens when we're honest about our struggles and brave enough to ask for help. She looked directly at the camera in the back of the auditorium, knowing her words would reach far beyond this room. If you're struggling with anxiety, with trauma, with anything that feels overwhelming, please know that you're not alone. Please know that asking for help is strong, not weak. And please know that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be present, be honest, and let yourself be supported by the people and animals who love you. As Emma stepped back from the podium, the audience erupted. But it wasn't the superficial applause that greets entertainment. It was the kind of response that comes when people have genuinely heard something true, something that touched them on a deeper level. The standing ovation lasted for over a minute. Judge Chen approached Emma afterward with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for honoring what happened that day with the truth," the judge said. "You could have sensationalized it, could have leaned into the mystery, but instead, you chose honesty. That takes more courage than commanding silence ever could." Over the following months, Emma's speech was watched millions of times online. But unlike the viral moment in the courtroom, which had been distorted and sensationalized, Emma's speech seemed to actually move people toward genuine understanding. Mental health advocates cited her words. Schools invited her to speak to students about anxiety and service dogs. Universities requested her participation in panels about trauma recovery. And importantly, applications to the Pacific Coast Service Dogs Foundation tripled as people recognized service dogs not as mystical tools, but as legitimate therapeutic interventions. Emma's parents, working together, helped navigate these opportunities. They remained her protective guardians, ensuring that their daughter's story was told on her terms, with her consent, in her authentic voice. They turned down sensationalist interview requests and instead supported Emma's appearances in educational contexts. A year and a half after the courtroom incident, Emma started high school. She was no longer the mysterious internet phenomenon. She was a girl with anxiety and a service dog, working hard in her classes, spending time with her friends, and living as normal a life as possible given everything that had happened. Captain remained at her side, not as a symbol or a miracle worker, but as her genuine companion, her daily support, her constant friend. And on particularly difficult days, when Emma felt her anxiety rising, she would still use the silence protocol, that subtle gesture, that whispered word, to find the calm within herself and her dog. The command that had once seemed to command an entire courtroom into silence had revealed its true power. It could silence the noise inside Emma's own mind, could create a space where healing was possible, could remind her that she had the tools within her to manage her own nervous system. The story of Emma Martinez and Captain didn't end with the viral moment or the media frenzy. It continued, quiet and real, in the everyday moments of a girl learning to live with her trauma, supported by the people who loved her and the dog who understood her nervous system in ways that words could never fully explain. And that, Emma realized, was far more powerful and meaningful than any mystery or miracle could ever be.